All right, Daniel chapter 1 says this. It says, in the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with some of the vessels of the house of God. And he brought them into the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and placed the vessels in the treasury of his God. Then the king commanded Ashpenaz, his chief eunuch, to bring some of the people of Israel, both of the royal family and of nobility, youths without blemish, of good appearance, and skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace, and to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans. The king assigned them a daily portion of the food that the king ate, and of the wine that he drank. They were to be educated for 3 years, and at the end of that time they were to stand before the king. Among these were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah of the tribe of Judah. And the chief of the eunuchs gave them names. Daniel he called Belteshazzar. Hananiah he called Shadrach. Mishael he called Meshach. And Azariah he called Abednego. But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food, or with the wine that he drank. Therefore he asked the chief of the eunuchs to allow him not to defile himself. And God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs. And the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who assigned your food and your drink. For why should he see that you are in worse condition than the youths who are of your own age? So you would endanger my head with the king. Then Daniel said to the steward, whom the chief of the eunuchs had assigned over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our appearance and the appearance of the youths who eat the king's food be observed by you, and deal with your servants according to what you see. So he listened to them in this matter and tested them for 10 days. At the end of 10 days it was seen that they were better in appearance and fatter in flesh than all the youths who ate their king's food. So the steward took away their food and the wine they were to drink, and gave them vegetables. As for these 4 youths, God gave them learning and skill in all literature and wisdom. And Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. At the end of the time, when the king had commanded that they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. And the king spoke with them, and among all of them none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they stood before the king. And in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters that were in all his kingdom. And Daniel was there until the first year of King Cyrus. Well, all around the world, God's people have been and are being persecuted simply for being Christian. We can think of ISIS, right? That's just the most common, the most recent. That one just comes to mind the most, right? And their persecution of Christians who are living in the Palestinian states, who have already been paying the jizya, it's just an Islamic word for the tax, in order to live peaceably in Islamic countries, and now they're suddenly forced out of their homes. We can think of Christians who were slaughtered at the hands of ISIS in the streets of their towns, right? They were shot, they were hung, even crucified. But persecution is not always physical. In more developed nations, in first world countries, right, persecution is often political. It can be ideological, right, or intellectual. In the United States, Christians have begun to face a reality that other brothers and sisters around the world have been living under, which is the inclusion of homosexuals into the union of marriage. I mean, we're not the first people in the world to have undergone this idea of same-sex marriage. It's already happened in other places. The U.S. and Christians here are just kind of catching up. Christians in Canada, for instance, are not even able to speak about these issues already, as they might be charged with hate crimes. We're living in a hostile world. A world that is particularly hostile to Christians and the Christian faith. I mean, let's just put it out there, right? It's hard to be Christian in the world that we're living in. In the West, Christians don't think much about persecution because it's uncomfortable. I mean, a lot of times, it makes us uncomfortable to think about persecution. You know, I mean, we don't like watching movies where Christians are, Christians are the ones who are getting it. It's discomforting even for us to think personally, of how we would handle a persecution situation. We don't often think about, well, what would I do if somebody walked in right now, put a gun to my head, and asked me, "Do you believe in God?" We don't like to think about those situations. They just make us uncomfortable. And a lot of times, our mentality is just, it can't happen to me. It won't happen to me.
But if that was to happen, then we would have to,
Hopefully.
yeah.
Yeah, hopefully. You know. So the questions, that we ask ourselves when we think of those is, would I stay faithful? Would I be the kind of person who would stay faithful? How can I face such a powerful suffering with resolve? God's people have had to face these very serious questions in the past, just like we have to face them today. In the book of Daniel, we're given an account of a group of Jews who have been forcibly removed from their home and their homeland, and they're brought to a totally different country with a totally different meta-narrative or worldview, if you want to call it that, okay, about the way the world really works and the way the world was made, the ethics that are behind it. You guys remember from our apologetics class when we talked about the questions that drive a worldview, the Babylonians had their own worldview. In the book of Daniel, we're introduced to the earliest group of exiles who were taken by Nebuchadnezzar to Babylon, the most powerful and beautiful city in the world at that time. It was one of the 7 wonders of the world, the Hanging Gardens in Babylon. Okay, now not knowing what lay ahead of them, they went forward. And they found a resolve to stay faithful in an unfaithful world. Now, this first chapter in Daniel pretty much sets the tone for the entire book. Okay, a lot of the books in the Old Testament are that way. If you grab the first chapter, pretty much lets you know what the rest of the book is about. That's just one of those ways of the way that they wrote back then. But we need to pay special attention to Daniel chapter 1. If we pretty much pick up Daniel chapter 1, if you pick up the big picture and the themes that are in it, you can pretty much grab the rest of the book, and you're actually going to see that the same thread, the same theme that runs through Daniel 1 runs all the way to the end of the book. Okay? So, we're going to begin by looking first at the temptation to unfaithfulness. Okay, that's going to be in verses 1 through 7. Then the resolve to faithfulness in verses 8 through 21. And then finally we'll ask the question, basically, how we can be faithful in an unfaithful world. So let's get started. Now, the historical setting. I talked a lot about it last week. Let me just kind of pick us up again here. Okay? The historical setting of this narrative, it's laid out in verses 1 and 2. Okay, Babylon is the rising power in the world at that time. They're currently making their presence known. They've just defeated Syria. I believe they defeated Syria in 609 BC, and so this is 605 BC when the story takes place, when it starts. But Babylon is the rising power. They have to let everybody know, hey, we're the people in charge. You guys are going to pay tribute and taxes, all that kind of stuff. You're paying that to us now. Oh, and by the way, let's just take a little something from you, right? Okay. It's important to note that it is the Lord who gave Jerusalem and its spoil, including the vessels of the temple, into the hands of Nebuchadnezzar. Okay, God gave. All right, Israel has the northern kingdom. They've already suffered their exile. They were defeated by Assyria in 722 BC. But now it's the southern kingdom's turn. Now they've been engaging in their own idolatry, and they're about to be ousted from the land. They're about to experience God's judgment for themselves. But the credit is not given to Babylon's military superiority or Nebuchadnezzar's leadership. Okay, God is the one who has said that he is in charge of his own things. God is the one giving Jerusalem over. God is the one who gave the articles from the temple into the hands of Nebuchadnezzar. God is in charge of his own things. God is sovereign. Okay, we need to keep that detail in mind through this whole book. The significance of Babylon taking the vessels of the house of God, right? What's this all about? Why are they taking the dishes from the temple, right? It's kind of like a trophy, okay? If you guys have ever played that game or just at least know what it's about, that capture the flag. You guys have ever heard of that, right? You go to one side, you take their flag, and you have to take it to your side, and they have to get the flag back to their side, and et cetera, et cetera. You capture each other's flag, right? Well, that's kind of what's going on here, okay? Basically, this idea of taking the vessels out of the temple was a way of saying, our gods are better than your God, and we can prove it because we have the stuff that belongs to your God in our temple. If you guys remember back in First Samuel, when the ark, right, Israel is defeated. They try to take the ark into battle because they think that God is going to bless them militarily, simply because they took the ark, and the military of Israel is defeated, and the ark is taken by the Philistines, and it's placed into the temple of their god Dagon. Well, that's the same idea. It was a way of saying, look, we have the stuff of your God. Our God is better, and we have his stuff to prove it. Okay, so that's what that's all about. Now keep that detail in mind, because these vessels are going to come up again in Daniel chapter 5. All right, we're going to see them again. Now, Babylon is also described as being in the land of Shinar. Okay, if that doesn't sound familiar, read Genesis 11. The Tower of Babel was set up in the land of Shinar. Okay, so basically this is Babylon, this is Babel set up all over again. In the Old Testament, the name Shinar especially suggests a place of false religion, right? It was a place where humanity tried to exalt themselves, build a tower, basically, and proclaim themselves as their own gods, right? It's a place of self-will and of self-aggrandizement. Okay, it was a place of opposition to God. It was a hostile place to people of faith. It was an unfaithful place. And not only did Nebuchadnezzar bring religious items from the temple, but he brought people with him too. He brought those who are created in the image of God. But he didn't take just anybody. He didn't, just take the slaves or anything like that. Rather, he brought the royalty. He brought nobility. He brought the Bible says here, it says he brought the youths without blemish, of good appearance, and skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, learning, and competent to stand in the king's place. Basically, he went to the best of the best in Jerusalem. Okay, he went to their Harvard, to their Yale, to their MIT, and he took their top students. He took their top people, their top workers, and he brought them over to Babylon. He brought them over to Babylon to serve his own interests, basically, to serve the courts of Babylon, to serve the kingdom of Babylon. Now, usually when a people was deported back then, this is the way military warfare worked. Basically what you did was you relocated a people out of their land, you took them usually into your land, and usually what you did was you continued to oppress them in their land. You would, use them for target practice. You would continue to make fun of them. You would continue to humiliate them, basically. Babylon got smart, right? I mean, you do that to a people enough, you're going to rebel, and now, oh great, we got to deal with a rebellion in the city. Babylon got smart, and they said, no, we're not going to do that. We're not going to do that. Instead, we're not going to, what's the word I'm looking for? We're not going to oppress them. We're not going to demonize them. We're going to ask them to come in. And we're going to ask them to become Babylonians with us. We're going to have them look at our city. I mean, there's a ton of gold there, apparently. The Ishtar Gate, I believe they have it in somewhere in Germany. It's some big museum, but the thing's huge. The gate, they've got a replica of it. It's a huge gate. The picture that's out there, that's part of the Ishtar Gate. But it was the gate that you walked into Babylon. I forget how high it was, about 60 feet high. It had gold lions and eagles and other animals that were in it. Okay, I mean, it was a very splendid looking gate. It was a very splendid looking city. And so they're invited, and instead of oppressing the Jews with their culture, they're basically trying to subjugate them by assimilation. The Babylonians decide to invite them into it, and so basically these Jews are going to be undergoing an intense socio-cultural and theological re-education program. It says that they're going to be taught the language of the Chaldeans and the literature of the Chaldeans so that they could speak like good Babylonians and learn the origin stories of Babylon so that they could learn to think like Babylonians too. I mean, in a sense, when God saved Israel, when he saved them out of Egypt, they didn't have a creation story. And it wasn't until Moses wrote, that God revealed what happened in creation. Moses writes the book of Genesis, and now the people of Israel, they have a story. And they know who they are, and they know where they're from. And so what Nebuchadnezzar tries to do is he tries to tell them, no, not that story. This is your new story. And this is what a worldview you're going to have now. This is what your life is going to be built on. Learn our language, learn our stories, so that you can be redefined, lose your identity, and become somebody else. This is one of Satan's strategies against God's people. There are many Christians who have not yielded, right? Thankfully, they have not yielded their faith even to physical persecution, right? And it's true what they say, right? The blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. But while many Christians have resolved to not yield their faith in the face of tyranny or in the face of physical persecution, yielding in the face of pleasure and seduction is quite another thing. Let me say that again, right? Yielding in the face of pleasure and seduction is quite another thing. We see that in the book of Numbers, right? The people, they're faithful against one group of people, but then Balaam says, you know what? I know how we'll get them. I can't curse them, okay? But I know what I can do. I can make them fall through idolatry and through sexual temptation. And God's people fell that way. Now, another part of the assimilation program is giving new names to these captives. Okay, as we're introduced to our characters in verse 6, no quickly do we read in verse 7, right, that their old names are taken away and they're given new names. This is part of this identity wipe program. Okay, now naming someone or something in the Bible, it usually demonstrates a person's authority over it, right? When Adam when all the animals are brought to him, he names the animals, showing Adam's place, that Adam had the authority to say what these animals were. I'm not going to get to the part where Adam named the woman, right? No, we're not going to say that. Anyway, I just said. Okay? God also gives new names to people in the Bible, demonstrating his authority, his authority to redefine and rename these people, right? Abram suddenly becomes Abraham. Right, he's given breath in his name, and he's given a new name. Who else? Jacob is renamed to Israel. Right, Simon is renamed to Peter. You know who never gets named, in a sense, by somebody else in the Bible? God, because nobody has authority over God to name God. He's the only one who can name himself. So, I mean, in our worship, we're not allowed to call God anything that he has not revealed himself to be. God reveals his names, and those are the only names that he's to be known by. A little side note there. But here, the enemies of God's people are attempting, okay, to give them new names to assert their authority over them. I kind of imagine it. I guess if you put it this way, you know, they're Daniel and his friends. They're coming in. They're beaten. They're tired. They're hungry. They've made a 900-mile long journey, right? If you remember the distance from Jerusalem to Babylon through all the winding roads and mountains and stuff like that. 900 miles, right? And then they get there, and I'm almost picturing like a scene like from Gladiator when they're selling these slaves, okay? And Daniel, you know, they come up and this guy's just sitting there behind a desk, and what's your name? Oh, my name's Daniel. No, now your name is, and they're given a new name, and they're given a new Babylonian name. The name Daniel means God is my judge. Okay, in the Hebrew, where you see usually El, okay, like Michael, okay, that usually means God. Elion, okay, that means God is my judge. Hananiah means Yah or Yahweh has been gracious. Mishael means who is what God is. Okay, in a sense, the uniqueness of God. And Azariah means that Yahweh has helped. All of these truths about God, in a sense, what the Babylonians are trying to do is to erase them from the memory of God's people. They want Daniel to forget that God is their judge, not the Babylonians. They want them to forget that God has ever helped them. They want them to think that, no, your God has abandoned you. And so when they're given these new names, they're given Babylonian names. The name Daniel, he gets the name Belteshazzar, which means may Bel protect his life. May Bel protect the king, right? Okay. Bel was another title for the head god in the Babylonian pantheon. Marduk, okay, he was the head Babylonian god. Shadrach means the command of Aku, who is the moon god in the Babylonian pantheon. Meshach means who is what Aku is. You can almost see the Babylonians are mocking the very names. They're mocking them. I mean, from who is what God is to all of a sudden know who is what Aku is. Okay? And Abednego means servant of Nebu. Nego was the name of a Babylonian god for wisdom in agriculture, so there's a kind of play on words there that they use to name Abednego. But again, I mean, that's part of this identity wipe program. And in one sense, when Satan does this to us, you can see what's going on here, right? Satan wants us to ask, hey, he wants us to forget who God is. He wants us to forget what God is. He wants us to forget what God has done and how gracious He has been and how He has helped us. So again, imagine the scene, right? That's what the story's supposed to do. You've got these tired Jews, 900-mile walk. I don't know if they had them tied up or what, or if they caravaned them, I'm not sure. But they've got to be tired. They've got to be hungry. They've got to be depressed. They've had a long time to think about their situation and where they're headed. Who knows what confusion is waiting? Maybe, they're like, oh man, they're gonna do all types of horrible things to us. Instead, they get there, and basically Babylon wants to appear to be their savior. So they arrive, and there's just tables that are laid out for them with the king's meat, wine, all types of goodies that are served there out on the table. The word that is used to describe the delicacies is it's a particular word. It's potbog, okay, the pat bag, okay, potbog, okay, which is essentially the king's rich food. Nothing probably looked better to a people who were defeated, confused about where God was. They were depressed, worn out, and no doubt hungry. So these guys are vulnerable to looking to Babylon. They're looking to Babylon, right? I mean, it's very easy to say, what does Babylon have to offer? And look, these are good things coming from the king of Babylon. And now Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar is presenting himself in a sense as their savior. You're tired and hungry. Let me be the one to nourish you. And again, sometimes Christians, we do the same thing. Perhaps in the culture wars, right? Perhaps we get tired of standing firm. We get tired of holding on to the faith. We get tired in the work of God. We get tired, I'd say this right back about my single days, right? We can get tired of living a Christian life as a single. Some people get tired of living a Christian life as married people. This whole Ashley Madison scandal is proof of that even in marriage, people get tired of living as a Christian because it's rough. We're in a hostile world, right? And there comes Satan. There comes Satan to test us in a sense, but not with a bad thing, but with a good thing. There's food on the table, right? There's food on the table for these guys, right? We get tired. Here just some more things, right? Because part of this is a singles group, but we get tired possibly. I can't say we. I'm married now, right? But you get tired of waiting for a Christian date. How's that? We get tired of being good.
We get nothing in return.
Yeah.
That's what they think.
Yeah. Not seeing anything. We get tired of being excluded. We get tired of waiting for God. How's that? When we get tired of waiting for God. For these exiles, there's nothing wrong with food in and of itself, right? God made it. Ultimately, right? He owns the cattle on 1,000 hills. Do you know what that cattle is for? Ribeyes, okay? That cattle is for ribeyes, all right? But certain foods, they're not inherently evil, right? You're welcome. Okay? But, in a sense, the questions can start to run into our mind, right? Like, well, what does it matter in the long run? Kind of like you said, I'm not seeing anything come from this. I'm not seeing anything, but, Christians, we've been faithful and faithful and faithful. And what happens? Boom. Supreme Court decisions. What happens? And we think about it and we just, what does it matter in the long run? And so we can start to reason this way. Well, let's just focus on spiritual things and let's just leave the culture to itself. Or we can reason this way. I have my career to take care of now. I got to let things go. Or this one, I've got my future to attend to and I need to make sure that I can retire comfortably. Or what about this one? Well, God wants me to be happy, right? He wants me to be happy, doesn't he? Daniel's encounter, it raises issues about how Christians should interact with their own cultures. Reinhold Niebuhr, and I've got these on your notes, okay, he suggested that there are roughly 5 ways that Christians can interact with their culture. Okay, they're listed there as opposition, agreement, what he called Christ above culture, tension, or Reformation transformation. Okay. Now, Daniel could have chosen opposition, right? He could have chosen opposition as the way that he's going to act with this new culture that he's found himself in, and completely refused assimilation and possibly lived in the Jewish ghettos outside of the city like the exiles did in the book of Ezekiel. He could have vehemently refused the food and his identity, education, and become a martyr for his faith. That is, the food could have been brought to him and he said, you know what, I don't want any of this stuff. You're going to rename me? No, you're not. He could have, he could have just been upfront, very very in your face about his own faith to them. That would have got him killed real quick, probably, right? Defiance right away. Many Christians are like this sometimes, preferring to live in opposition and or isolation to the culture. An isolation model could be seen in the Amish, right? There's one particular way. Okay, there's not so much opposition, but they do isolate themselves.
For protection?
Part of for protection. But they isolate themselves. They don't want to have anything at all to do with the outside world, anything outside of their community. They just isolate themselves. Okay. Other more extreme Christians, they protest any and everything, viewing all of culture and the world as evil. You can think of Westboro Baptist Church, right? Everything is evil. Let's protest. Let's picket. Whatever it is. But this exploitation, in a sense, of the world. They still live in the world. They still use the resource. They're still using, electricity that comes from places outside the church, etc. But this exploitation, in one sense, it uses the resources in their cities and societies, but without contributing at all to the well-being of society. These are the exiles, in a sense, that Jeremiah warned about, or warned in Jeremiah 29. He told them, no, guys, don't stay outside the city. You all need to move in. You all need to move in. You all need to live, plant, have children, do your life, and live for the benefit of the city. Now, another extreme approach, right on the other end, would be the agreement or the accommodation model. Okay, this is basically on Niebuhr's model is the agreement. Okay, but the agreement or accommodation model, on this approach, there's a complete capitulation to culture. Okay. Complete capitulation. What this would have looked like is Daniel would have gotten there and gone, hey, I can get used to this Babylonian stuff. Look at this food. Oh yeah, bring it. Can I have a little bit more of that? That would have been a complete capitulation to the culture. Now, the interesting thing about this model is that this kind of interaction with culture is that these people still claim to be Christians in this model. Okay? They're Christian in church. They're Christian at home. They're Christian around other Christians. However, they're secular when it comes to their work. They're secular when it comes to their politics. They're secular when it comes to the voting booth. That one has to come up, right? But we just need to call it out what it is, okay? They don't have a Christian worldview. In a sense, they're two people. There's no integrity in that life. They're one way in the church. They're one way around Christians. But when it comes to the bulk of their life, where you work, right? You spend more time at work than we do in church. When it comes to that, when it comes to your private life, recreation, your Christianity doesn't make a difference in those places. It doesn't at all. There's a complete capitulation there. For instance, what is it? This movement called gay Christianity. That you can be okay, in a sense, with the homosexual lifestyle and still call yourself Christian. That's a complete capitulation to culture. Don't want to say too much more about that. Secular in dating. Secular in marriage. Secular in morality. Christian sociologists have come to see this sort of view of Christianity as something that they call moralistic, therapeutic deism. Another approach, and this is where I think there's the middle ground here, and this is where we're going to see Daniel navigating in, but we can call that obedient involvement. Okay, obedient involvement. In Niebuhr's view, it would be kind of a blend of Christ above culture, tension, and the transformation models. Okay, it's kind of a blend of these. Okay, but this is precisely what God commanded through the prophet Jeremiah. Go into the city, love the city, pray for the city, but don't lose who you are as my people in the city. These are people who live and they do life while in exile, right? They still worship and serve God, but they're amongst the people. They haven't withdrawn themselves. Jesus himself said that his people should be the salt of the earth. And you think about it, right? Salt cannot do its work unless it penetrates the substance in which it acts upon. I mean, if I have a nice steak, right? Salt's not going to do any good if it's sitting at the other end of the table. It's not going to do any good until I sprinkle some on the steak, right? Then salt will do its work. God sprinkles his people in the darkness of the world to be salt and light. Now, will this be pleasant? Certainly not. Certainly not. I mean, Christians may find themselves, we might find ourselves, maybe we already have. We found ourselves in uncomfortable places, in uncomfortable circumstances. You know, I mean, just being at work sometimes and you hear what people talk about, and as a Christian, it might make you uncomfortable. But God wants us in there. He wants us on his mission, not ours. Now, despite the pressure that Babylon exerts, Daniel says in verse 8, he resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank. Now, the word defile here, it comes from the same class of words that the priests would use when they would talk about food or offerings that were unfit for sacrificial offering to the Lord. So there is a moral and a theological drive to Daniel's resolve. Okay. We don't know what this meant, that he was going to reject what was in store for him. We can't say that. I mean, he was on board with the program as far as what he was there for, what the king of Babylon intended. But he was going to have to make some decisions on how he was going to live his faith while in those circumstances. Daniel chooses to be involved, though. Okay, he doesn't say, well, I'm just going to go in there and buy my time, and then when I can find a way out, when I can, turn somebody over, or find my opportunity to rebel, then I'll take it. It's not what he does. That's not what he does. He chooses to be involved, but not involved enough to defile himself. Now, it needs to be stressed that Daniel chose to be involved. Daniel chose to be faithful to God in Babylon. A lot of times, we reason with ourselves sometimes. I would be more faithful to God if I was in certain circumstances. If things were just going this way, I would be more faithful. And look at Daniel. I mean, in the heart of paganism, right? There is where he chooses to be faithful to God. He could have chosen against this for several reasons. I mean, especially, just consider his own comfort. His own comfort. He could have just bailed out, either assimilate or rebelled against Babylon. But consider that refusing the royal diet from the king was to refuse the kindness of the king himself. Okay, I mean, the king stretches out his hand, and it's like, oh boy, what do I do here? What do I do? I mean, if you've ever been in those situations at the workplace where the boss offers you something. Right? I mean, it doesn't have to be anything bad. It could be like some gift or something, but it's kind of one of those situations where it's like if you take it, you're going to be in his pocket, but if you refuse it, you're going to be targeted. So it's like, oh, this is a tough spot to be, and that's kind of where Daniel is. So there's peer pressure there also too. I mean, think about it. Daniel and his friends, they're not the only ones there. There's people from other nations who have been conquered that are being that they're trying to be, they're trying to assimilate them into Babylonian culture too. You have Egyptians who are there. You have other nations. Who else would be there? Like the Edomites? No, not the Edomites. Some of the Assyrians too, leftovers from their empire are probably there undergoing re-education as well. And so there's the peer pressure from them, right? You see other people basically like, hey, go along with the program. Hey, what are you doing? Let's go. Don't get us in trouble. Don't make any moves. Don't make any waves this way. Daniel could have taken the meal to not ruin his chances for success. And I mean, here's something else, right? He could have said, well, I mean, I'm here. I'm going to have to find a way to climb the corporate ladder. I'm going to have to find a way to get ahead. So I guess I better just take the meal. I mean, hey, I'm going to have to learn how to cut corners somewhere. And that's how ruthless and shrewd the business world is nowadays. If you want to get ahead anywhere, you got to learn how to do it right. You got to learn how to cut corners, is what we're often told. Consider the temptation of the food itself. I mean, I'll tell you about me. If somebody gets a good piece of barbecue in front of me, a nice ribeye steak, I'm done. If there's top secret information that, let's say the government trusted me with top secret information and said, don't ever leak this out. If somebody were to take me to Rodizio's or a Brazilian steakhouse, I'm done. I'm like, you can have any information you want. Just get me in on that meal.
Hey, you weak.
Yeah, I know. It's horrible, right? You know, I mean, if there was a Brazilian steakhouse in Babylon, why lie, right? Babylon just gained one more in their population. Okay. What's saying? When in Rome, do as the Romans do. I mean, look at all these excuses Daniel could have come up with, that he could have had. You know, but finally, and maybe more tempting for Daniel and for the exiles whom God had brought to Babylon, whom God had given into the hand of the Babylonians, is that Daniel could have defiled himself out of bitterness toward God. Out of bitterness toward God. This last point is significant because many Christians stop serving God when hard times come. This is true. This happens. Many people suppose that the essence of Christianity is this, that if I do such and such for God, that God will give me my happy life, my good life. He'll give me all the things that I desire. But that's not Christianity. That's the essence of religion, and I'm using that in a pejorative sense, right? But that's really not serving God at all. It's serving yourself and using God to serve your own ends. And in a sense, who's the real God in that relationship? We are.
That person, yeah.
Yeah, we are. What has God taken from us that has made us think that He's not real anymore? I mean, a lot of people, and I know it's a cheesy example sometimes, but there's some truth in it. In the movie, God's Not Dead, the professor, right? What did God take from him that got him so angry, so bitter, and so upset that he just went off on sheer atheism? God took his mom. And that happens. I mean, tragedy and suffering are one of the easiest ways that gets people to drop their faith. I mean, even in the parable of the sower, right? There's some people that the seed died because riches choked it up, but there's another one where it says trouble and hard times came upon them, and the plant died. What tragedy has happened in our own lives? What trauma that made us say in our hearts, God, if this is how you treat the people who serve you, then I don't want to serve you anymore. Daniel, he's just lost his home. He's lost his parents, his way of life. You know, did he have someone special back home? Daniel's a teenager. He's of marriageable age. You know, was he betrothed? He was a teenager with his whole life ahead of him, and now he's training to serve in the Babylonian government as an advisor to the king. Some scholars have pointed out that Daniel and his friends, that they may have actually been made eunuchs when they got to Babylon. Who's his boss? It says he's asking the chief of the eunuchs. Well, what's Daniel doing there? A lot of scholars have suggested that it's possible that Daniel and his friends became eunuchs. This is one of the ways that those working closest to the king back then, that they couldn't threaten their throne. Okay, you know, they couldn't mess with the queen or anything like that. But it was a way of just, you know, dehumanizing these people in a sense of total subjugation of these people, so that they couldn't be any threat to the king. Nothing tests faith like suffering. I mean, obedience is easy when life's going how we want it, right? And when we feel like we're getting what we deserve, many people will serve God so long as they believe that God is serving them. Many people feel that God is their partner in life, and as long as they abide by the rules of the relationship, that God will give them whatever they want. As a result, many people, even some professing Christians, they come to believe that God owes them a good life or health, or at least a good-looking spouse, or insert whatever it is that you're really living for. And yet here's Daniel, not seeking to get what he thinks life owes him in the midst of his grief and oppression. And our question that we have to ask, that we have to consider, is why? And we'll answer that in just a bit. Now, notice Daniel's resolve, right? It's to not defile himself with the king's meat, and it's not for himself, but out of faithfulness to God. I have to say it, I have to reiterate this. This is not a Daniel diet, okay? He's not doing this to lose weight or to look good, despite whatever books are out there about these, Daniel fasts and things like that. That is so not the point of what is going on here, okay? Now, commentators disagree on the exact reason why Daniel refused the food. I mean, some people, well, it's because it was offered to idols. But if that's the case, other commentators point out, well, the vegetables would have been offered too. It's not like they said, let's only offer the meat to our gods, but not anything else. No, when they sacrificed to their god, they presented the whole tray to their god. So it couldn't have been just because it was offered to idols. Okay? The text says, it says literally that Daniel says that he's going to eat, or only wants to have only that which is from sown seed. Okay? Which has led commentators to believe that Daniel's food choice would be those that God provides naturally, with no human preparation. I mean, if you want to eat meat, you have to kill the calf, cut it up, spice it up, all that kind of stuff. It takes some preparation. In a sense, fruits and vegetables, they don't need preparation. I mean, they didn't have steamers back then, okay? They didn't have anything like that. But I mean, you could just eat the fruit. Basically, in a sense, basically the way Daniel saw it was that I want what God has made, and I want what God has provided, not what the king and his, and his particular chefs and cooks, not what they have provided. I don't want their riches. I want the riches that come from God. In a sense, is what he was saying with his choice of diet. That's why he refused wine. I'll take water. Why? Water's water, right? I mean, that's pretty much it. Wine, I mean, you've got to, get all the grapes, stuff like that, trample them, and they got to go through a fermentation process, all that kind of stuff. Okay, it takes some work. There's got to be a human element into it, but it's like water. Well, water, I mean, it comes out of a spring. It comes out of a well. It's natural. It's something, in a sense, that God alone has to provide, because, I mean, last time I looked, we don't make water. We don't make it, right? I mean, we have to make wine, but we don't make water. We find it. It's provided by God. Now, notice right here that Daniel is taking his faith with him into the academy and into his workplace. He's not separating what he does at work with who he is at home. Daniel, he's a faithful Jew in private and in public. He takes his faith with him. He lets his faith influence his decisions. At this point, he's letting his faith influence his diet. This is the essence of what it means to live faithfully in an unfaithful world. Taking your faith with you everywhere, not just some places. Now, in the second half of verse 8 and all the way through verse 16, right, with God's favor upon him, we see Daniel approaching the boss, okay, the chief of the eunuchs, right? And Daniel, he does so politely, okay, because this chief eunuch, he's got his own worries and his own cares. Nebuchadnezzar's a loose cannon, okay? He's a loose cannon. He can kill somebody at a whim. And the eunuch fears that, hey, you know what, if I deviate from the plan, if I produce one of these exiles and he's thinner and he's not healthy, he's not up to par, the king's going to kill me. So he's got his own worries and concerns, right? And Daniel comes up to him politely and respectfully. You think about it too, again, right? Daniel, a servant of the one true God, okay, of the right religion, he doesn't condescend to this person. He doesn't talk over him, thinking, I have more rights. My God's better than your God. Mine's the true God. Yours is just an idol. He doesn't approach him with that attitude. He approaches him gently and respectfully. Remember 1 Peter 3:15, right? Set apart Christ as Lord in your heart and be ready to give an answer for the hope that is within you, but with gentleness and respect. One commentator, he said this. He said, the call to be polite applies to our attitude to people like the advocates of abortion and gay rights, right? That's a tough one, because for Christians, a lot of times, we want to get hostile very quick. I mean, you can see videos on the internet of very, very hostile-looking Christian crowds protesting abortion. They're doing a good thing, but, in a sense, how we do it it has to work together with the message. It has to work together with the message. He continues, abortion and marriage, to those who disagree with our principles at the places of work and those who hate all that is associated with the name of Christ. The call to be polite applies there. Your boss may not understand Christianity. Your professor, your teachers, your friends may not understand the gospel. Your own parents, right, may not see why you do things, why you don't do things like everyone else, right? I mean, if you were the only Christian sibling in your family, maybe you heard things like that. Why can't you just be like your brother? Why can't you just be like your sister? Why can't you just be like, and we get those things even from our own family sometimes. Yet God requires that we be credible witnesses of the grace of God in the world. I mean, like it or not, people look at Christians to see if our Christianity really makes a difference in our lives. People really do. I mean, when we talked about in apologetics, right? Ethos, pathos, logos, right? A lot of times people don't even get an audience until they look at you first. I'm pretty sure, if somebody, when somebody new, hopefully I'm past this with you guys, right? But usually when somebody new comes in here, a lot of times they're not listening to anything that I have to say at first. They're kind of checking out, my demeanor. Am I angry? Am I mad? Am I laid back? Am I too abrasive and stuff? I don't know where I am on those. Sometimes I do, but they look at that first before they'll give me, in a sense, any credibility. It's the same for all of us in our Christianity. People are going to look at our lives first, and if it doesn't make a difference to us, the minute you try to share Christianity with them, it's just going to be like, well, if it doesn't make a difference for you, what's it going to do for me? Angry and upset Christians give the whole church a bad name. Professing Christians who protest angrily, who have to insult those who are not like them, who complain as much as non-Christians, or who are as pessimistic about life and everyone else. Like it or not, we are, one commentator said, we are the test of the gospel. Like it or not, before people will look at Christ, many people will first look at his followers to see whether what he has done for them makes Jesus worth looking at. But God's favor comes to Daniel. It comes through the guards as they test Daniel for 10 days. The boss basically says, okay, I normally shouldn't do this, but I'll go ahead and test you for 10 days. I'll give you the diet that you want. But if it's not working, you're going to have to eat the king's food. And Daniel says, okay, I'll do it. Okay? But God proves his faithfulness in that Daniel and his friends, they all were better in appearance than those who partook of the king's delicacy. And so this allows Daniel, right, and his friends, ultimately what this does for them is it allows them to learn from the Babylonians for the next 3 years, right? So we're going to be jumping around in Daniel's, in his time, right? But it allows him to complete basically his liberal art education, right, in dream interpretation and the culture of Babylon, okay, at a secular university. Daniel is in, we think, don't go to that school, they're not Christian, they're completely pagan, etc. It's like, that's where Daniel's at. That's where he went to school. That's where he just got his degree from. And as one commentator said, he said, the wise person knows how to learn from the wisdom of other peoples without being overcome by it. The book of Proverbs, this one might surprise you. The book of Proverbs are not all Solomon's original Proverbs. A lot of those Proverbs, word for word, come from Egyptian Proverbs that are predated well before Solomon. But what could Solomon do? Solomon recognized wisdom even from other people. And he could say, yes, this is true. Does that mean Solomon became Egyptian? No, but he was able to recognize that all truth is God's truth, and I can still learn from other people. Christians are sometimes shocked to learn that there are non-Christians who are smarter, wiser, and even more moral than some Christians. David Helm, he offers a little bit more insight here. He says this. He says, notice that a secular education in Babylon was not something to be feared by God's people. This is an important point because as historians like Mark Noll and leaders like Charles H. Malick have pointed out, the Christian retreat from secular institutions of higher learning and the establishment of an alternative education system, largely a closed system that is focused on keeping the world out, have had some negative consequences, in a sense of ghettoizing Christian education. And Christians pulling out of education and higher learning institutions and saying, you know what, we don't like that, we're going to form our own Christian place. And this place is going to be only for Christians, taught by Christians, only Christian students can enroll, okay? And he goes on, he says, there are a large group of Christians who are not only unfamiliar with the makeup of the hearts and minds of their non-Christian counterparts, but they are content to live without them. Content to live without them. In a sense, it's Christians who develop a Jonah heart, who don't want to go to Nineveh, who don't want to go and be among those who are created in God's image. And in a sense, Christians dropping out of these institutions, it's a way of Christians saying, we don't want to be in here, we don't want to be salt, we don't want to be light, we're out. Raises questions, right? How do we work for God where we're at? Do we work just to collect our paycheck from our employer? Or do we work for the benefit of humanity? Do we work to serve the people that our jobs ultimately, whatever they contribute to? Do we have our jobs to serve ourselves, or do we do our jobs to serve others? Now, right, enough depressing stuff, right? After hearing about all the faithfulness of Daniel, we might be saying to ourselves at this point, right, how can I be faithful like that? how can I be faithful like that? Now, interestingly enough, this question, I believe it's the right question, but it's also the wrong question. Okay, let me explain. Okay, one, it's the right question because the motive to be faithful to God is fundamentally correct, but the means that the question presupposes, okay, is all wrong because it's asking, how can I? And it starts from there, and that's where I think it's fundamentally wrong, right? If we're honest with ourselves, under our own strength and under our own resources, we're not faithful. We haven't been faithful, and we might not be faithful. You know, I mean, we can think of our own shortcomings in our life. Many of us here, you know, we might try to read the book of Daniel and conveniently insert ourselves in Daniel's character. I mean, when I was a kid, I mean, maybe I still do it sometimes, right? But when I would watch movies, you know, I would be like, oh, I'm that guy. You know, oh, I'm that hero or something like that. And a lot of times we read the Bible that way, and we put ourselves, and we might say, I'm Daniel. When I read this book, I'm Daniel, that's me, you know, and when we read the Bible that way, especially the Old Testament, the Bible kind of becomes a book of moral stories. It becomes basically, you know, a self-help book. That if we just live like that, God will save us, or God will be good to us. If that's our conclusion and that's our approach, then we're not reading the story closely enough. The clue to the real hero of the story, the real faithful person, is revealed in these two words: God gave. In verse 2, we read that it was the Lord who gave Jerusalem into the hands of Babylon. That proved first his faithfulness to his own covenant curses that he said would come upon them if they did not obey him. In verse 9, we also read that it is God who gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief eunuch. It's not because Daniel was so committed to his religion. It's not even because Daniel was so nice and considerate of the eunuch's situation, right, with Nebuchadnezzar. It was God being faithful to Daniel. In verse 17, it says that it was God who gave Daniel and his friends the learning, the skill in literature, and the wisdom that they would need to serve in the Babylonian court. Along with that, it was God who gave Daniel understanding in visions and dreams. Now, what does this tell us about God? It tells us that God is sovereign in all that he does. It tells us that God is self-sufficient, that he does not need anything, including the right circumstances, to be who and what he is for his people. God is God. I mean, this is the worst circumstances for God's people. They're in exile. They're out of their promised land. They're away from the temple. They can't offer sacrifices. This is the worst place to be. And yet God is right there. God is still God. He doesn't need the right circumstances for him to be faithful to his people. And so the nature of God should give us comfort, especially in suffering. If there's any time that the world appears to be completely out of control, it's when suffering strikes them. Tsunamis, hurricanes, tornadoes, school shootings, loss of a job, lost love. All of these things are enough to make anybody doubt God. And Daniel's story, I mean, it sounds strangely familiar. It should, right? A young boy taken away from his family and taken off into a foreign land, being educated. Sounds like Joseph's story, doesn't it? Yeah, it's got the exact same structure as the story of Joseph. And Joseph, he ultimately took comfort in the sovereignty of God. I mean, Joseph could ultimately say, you know, when his brothers, you know, they feared for their lives because now their father died, and they're like, Joseph's going to get us now. And Joseph said, no, guys, God is the one who sent me here. You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. Joseph could say God was working all along, despite the suffering that he went through. God was working. The comfort of a sovereign God is that when life seems to be falling apart, God is ever and always working out his plans. And if we do not believe that about God, if we believe that God's plans can be thwarted, okay, by man's plans and man's will, and that God, in a sense, God kind of becomes that GPS navigation system that when you miss an exit, it has to reroute and find you another way. Okay, you know, and sometimes we think God is like that. That when I mess up God's, you know, oh, I messed up God's plans. Therefore, God will have to, in his wisdom, find another way to get me there because I blew his plan. No. If we understand what Daniel's story is telling us, if we understand what Joseph was telling us, that no, There is no way to mess up God's plans. That what seems to be mess ups for us is really God working out his best. If we think God is just like that GPS navigation system, I mean, we might have a little comfort, but I mean, ultimately, we're going to be left wondering, when's the next detour going to happen? And it's going to drive us to despair and thinking, you know what, I might mess up God's plan for my life. You know, man, I should have, I should have gotten married when I was younger. You know, I should have taken that job offer. I should have done this. I should have done that. And we can look at our life. If we look at it as, you know what, I messed up God's plans for my life. Boy, that can put us into despair in the present and also in the future. But if we can look back at our life and say, you know what, God was in charge of all that. God has me where he wants me at this very moment. There's hope in that. There's comfort in that. Daniel and his friends, they would not give in to the pressure because God had not given up on them. God is the faithful character in this story. God's faithfulness, it led to and it grounded the faithfulness of Daniel and his friends. And so the question, you know, here's for us, right? I mean, what about us? Has God been faithful to us? I mean, here's the questions sometimes we can ask. God, where were you when that tragedy struck my life? God, where were you when I needed you the most? God, where were you when I fell into sin and that ruined my life forever? The answer is that God was always there. God, where were you when cancer hit me? Boy, that's a big one. God, where were you when that person walked out of my life? God, where were you when I lost my job? God was there working his best. The good news of the gospel is not that God is faithful to those who are faithful to him. Rather, the good news of the gospel is that God has faithfully promised to deliver compromised, unfaithful, disobedient, and hostile people to himself. The good news of the gospel is that our salvation does not rest on our ability to stay faithful to him, but in his faithfulness to us in Jesus Christ. Because, I mean, if we're reading the story right, we need to read it in light of the whole Bible. Jesus is the ultimate Daniel. Jesus is the ultimate Daniel. He's the one. He's given by God to a world that hated him. And Daniel was thrust out. Jesus went willingly into ours. Jesus agreed to come into our world. He wasn't snatched away. He willingly plunged himself into a hostile world. Jesus, he faced temptations that we would never truly know, right? He faced temptations for food, right? Hey, Jesus, if you are the Son of God, I know you're hungry. That stone right there, if you just turn it into bread, be all right. He was tempted, but Jesus, his temptations were greater because he was tempted against his purity. I mean, when we're tempted to just act out our sinfulness. Jesus was tempted against his purity. Jesus committed himself to God who sustained him in his human nature. In Hebrews 4:15 it says that Christ was one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet he was without sin. I mean, as great as a hero as Daniel appears in this book, Daniel is still a sinner. I mean, let's not forget, Daniel is in the position that he's in because the people that he's a part of have been sinning against God. Daniel is still part of that crew. I mean, and it's by his corporate identity with the people. Daniel is a part of that. He has his own sins, but Jesus Christ, he does not. Jesus Christ, on the cross, he was delivered up and crucified by sinful men. The Bible says that Jesus' crucifixion was planned and predestined by God to take place. And so remember the question. When we ask why Daniel could still be faithful to God after all that happened to him and his countrymen, our answer is because God has been faithful in Jesus Christ. On the cross, Jesus Christ was faithful to God's promises to us as he received suffering from us. The irony of the cross is that God allowed men to do their worst while God was displaying his own faithfulness. And so coming to a close here, when we begin to see that our faithfulness to God depends on his faithfulness to Christ, not our ability. It depends on Christ's faithfulness. When we begin to see that, then we will find our strength for faithfulness. When we see him being faithful to us unto death, when we see the greater temptations that he faced, he was offered the riches of the entire world. I mean, sometimes sometimes we're just offered a quick passing thing, right? Just lie here, just lie there, just a quick thing. I mean, Jesus was offered the whole world. He was offered things that really would kill us. We don't think that they're that damaging to our soul, but I mean, the wages of sin is death. When we ask the question in a hostile world, God, are you still faithful? We have to look at the cross. We have to look at the cross. We have to remember the resurrection, and we have to remember the gospel. Don't lose your name, all right? In a sense, look at it that way. Don't lose your name. Don't lose your identity. Don't lose that Christian identity. When we see Jesus giving us his faithful life and record, we have a foundation for staying faithful in an unfaithful world. In a sense, we have to look at Christ. We have to look at his faithfulness. If we're not looking at his faithfulness, if the question is always, what do I need to do? And if we're, in a sense, if we're answering, or we're looking for the answer to that question of staying faithful in ourselves, we're always going to fall. We're always going to fall. But when we look at his faithfulness as grounding ours, that is where we find the strength. Because suddenly, getting real practical, right? When we face temptation, a lot of times we think, I can't do this or whatever, nobody's ever done this, I'm the only one. A lot of times we feel alone. But when we remember that Christ went through those too, now we have somebody. And we have somebody that we can look at. When we look that Christ took on a greater temptation, we start to say, in a sense, he took the greater so that I can make it through the lesser temptation. I can get through this smaller temptation because Christ endured the greater temptation. I can get through this unfaithful world because Christ is my ticket of faithfulness before God through this unfaithful world. Daniel's true faithfulness, we see it in the text. I hope I made it clear with the words God gave. That Daniel's true faithfulness was from God who was faithful to him. Daniel would not have been faithful if the Lord had not given him favor. If the Lord had not made his appearance before the king to be better than the others. He would not have been faithful if God didn't give him the wisdom and the learning and the understanding that he needed to succeed in his job. In a sense, Daniel's faithfulness, he could only be that way because God was faithful to him. We'll never find our faithfulness to God until we see him as the first one who was faithful to us in Jesus Christ. Really practical. When you find it hard to be faithful when the temptation comes, you remember the cross. You remember the gospel. And you look at Christ who endured suffering for us so that we could be faithful. In a sense, look at the cross as his faithfulness to us. And that will give us the resource, the drive, in a sense, when our hearts are moved and melted by that. When that takes its place, when Christ has our greater love, we start to let go of the things of this world. And we can learn to live faithfully. May God grant us eyes to see Jesus and the power of his resurrection life that he faithfully supplies so that we may live for him. Amen.